Welcome everybody, it's Speci, and today's video is sponsored by Card Market, the best place to buy your singles online in Europe. We had so many big tournaments over the weekend, including a 10k over in America and Malmo Games Week, which I was casting on my channel. If you didn't see any of the gameplay from that, there is 2 days of Disney Lorcana competitive action, which I live streamed and casted. And we're going to start off with Malmo Games Week top 3. We had Jonas, who was playing Amber Steel Songs. This Mirabelle Madrigal, they did say that they just wanted to play for a bit of fun and should be a couple of Robin Hoods. But the other big interesting card in this one was Zero to Hero. It is a card I was quite impressed with. Not convinced that you should be playing 3 copies of, but I do think it's a card which you could sneak in a copy of into your decks. You count the number of characters you have in play, and you pay that amount of ink less for the next character you play this turn. Jonas was very often able to play a 5-cost character on turn 3. So you play Cinderella on turn 1, something on turn 2 often, and then with the Cinderella, or the 2-cost character, I suppose, you can sing Zero to Hero, which is going to reduce the next character you play by 2 ink, and therefore you can ink, go up to 3 ink, pay 2 less, and play a 5-cost character on turn 3. Tempo, but moreover, a really cool line to see was this Cinderella Stout-Hearted being shifted on turn 3. Very, very powerful potential. Zero to Hero was quite clunky for a lot of the time for Jonas. I'm not really convinced by the Daisy Duck either, but I was quite impressed by Chempo. I think Chempo actually was a lot better than I expected it to be in a deck like this. Of course, Amber Steel can go quite wide quite quickly, so having a big beefy bodyguard which can protect your questers is a very interesting option. Into the top 2, we had Simon, who was the top seed after Swiss. They did actually manage to dodge Steel the whole tournament. But despite being the top seed in the finals, they weren't able to quite cross the finish line in game number 3. They had a really interesting take on Hyper Aggro going for Emerald and Amber. So, of course, we're used to seeing Amber with Hyper Aggro with things like Daisy Duck and Baloo. But with Emerald, you do get access to Ursa the Deceiver, which is giving you potentially a little bit of extra coverage against things like Grab Your Swords. Kick Cloud Kicker, and I think Pegasus is actually a bit of an underrated card in decks like this. We saw Simon go for a Daisy Duck on turn 1. On turn 2, I think a second Daisy Duck and then a Pegasus. But then on turn 3, shifting in that Pegasus, which turned both of those Daisy Ducks into 1/4 evasive characters. Almost impossible to stop. Clarabelle is an interesting backup option for this deck as well. If you're running out of steam a little bit, being able to shift that Clarabelle in on turn 5 is often going to draw you a lot of cards. And there was also a couple copies of Chernobog in there, which is pretty interesting as well to maybe give the deck some late game potential. Very, very difficult to stop questing for 3. Baloo some guaranteed lore, as is the Donald Duck. Overall, while this deck performed quite well, I think this is more a testament to how good Hyper Aggro is. I think that this deck is just a worse version of an Amber and Amethyst deck. I would much rather be playing Befuddles than a lot of the Emerald cards. But I do think it really shows you that there's so much potential for this aggro archetype to be playing multiple different colors. In fact, in a little bit, we're also going to be looking at a Amethyst Steel aggro deck, which did very well this weekend. So big shout out to Simon for bringing something spicy. While I'm not personally convinced by it as much, I still think it was a good deck. Of course it was. It was winning all the time until the last game of the weekend. And they lost to Sander here, who was on Amethyst Emerald, also the player finishing 4th, had this same list with 61 cards. Now, there's a lot about this deck I like. There are some things I'm not convinced by in terms of the build. Starting off with the things I like is just the overall core concept of the deck. I think that the deck has a lot of legs. I think it's a very good deck in the sense that it can be quite quick, but often it's quite slow and methodical and can play these drawn-out games with cards like the Amethyst bounce package, and then Lyle Tiberius Rourke being a really key card in this one, being able to stop your opponent gaining lore, gives you great coverage against Hyper Aggro. Of course, you've got some locations with the Queen's Castle and the Library. The overall bounce package was great. I think the Merlin Crab really impressed in this deck. With the Fox, it threatens 7 removal in a single swoop, which was really important at dealing with Cinderella Stout-Hearted, which is very popular in the current metagame in the Steel Song decks. Also just good at dealing with locations and other things like that. The Emerald Chromacon seemed like a really nice option as a one-off during your opponent's turns. Whenever one of your characters is banished, you may return chosen character to their player's hand. Definitely an interesting tool, particularly with Amethyst, because you can bounce back your goat, you bounce back your crab, all those kinds of things. The Elsa was a bit of a star of the show for the weekend for me. The Fifth Spirit really put in work with Rush, Evasive, but exerting a character when you play it, I think in particular, really, really strong. Even if you use Elsa to exert a character and challenge something else of Elsa, often you're able to take out that character you exerted with something like a Fox. And it seemed really, really strong. Also very good against those aggro decks. So this is a deck which is good against aggro in theory. It did beat aggro in the final despite being the lower seed and going second. It was able to take a 2-1 victory. There are some things I'm not convinced about, though, with this one. I think, personally, the deck looks to be a little bit slow for my taste. While I appreciate the deck can play these long, drawn-out games, I still think that you want to have that flexibility to have a more aggressive game plan when going first. And the one-cost characters are all very, very slow. There's no Chernobyls, there's no Magic Brooms. You guys know me, I love my Chernobyls and my Magic Brooms. So I would certainly look at building the deck slightly differently. The new Clarabelle is a really interesting option in this one, not playing the 3-cost one, but rather the 1-cost character and the Floodborn version of Clarabelle. Being able to deal with items is very good. For an Emerald Amethyst deck, it has been a weakness of the deck in the past. And of course, you can bounce the Clarabelle back multiple times. I suppose the question is how valuable is item removal in this metagame? And I think the answer is it's pretty valuable. There's a lot of Sapphire decks which are playing a lot of items. So having a card like Clarabelle, which can banish items multiple times, is good. And that then begs the question, well, if you're already playing the 1-cost Clarabelle, should you just play the Floodborn? And maybe the answer is yes. I'm not personally that convinced that Clarabelle is that good in an Amethyst deck, which has an abundance of card draw. Having said that, I think Clarabelle is never really that bad either. It's an inkable card, and you could certainly do a lot worse. There's also Mother Gothel, the 2-cost, as well as the 7-cost. Banzai was also a very, very, very impressive card for me this weekend with that 3 strength. 2 willpower, it works in a similar way to Mr. Smee. You can quest with it, and pretty much whatever your opponent's going to challenge, the Banzai is going to trade with, at least in the early game. Something like a Madam Mim Snake, Madam Mim Fox. You get 2 lore and you trade. Really, really good potential on the Banzai. Your Welcome's in there as well. Probably not going to be very good without the Clarabelle. I would probably build this deck slightly differently. I think in particular, the card which I think is lacking here is Kit Cloud Kicker. There is 1 copy of it. I would be much more inclined to play 3, maybe even 4 copies of Kit in this deck. I think it's great with Amethyst. Being able to sing Friends, be able to bounce it back and utilize it multiple times, I think is really, really strong. I also think Lyle Tiberius probably should be at least 3 copies. Possibly 4 is too many simply because it's an uninkable card, but it's a really interesting deck. I think the Amethyst Emerald has so much potential, and clearly this deck performed really, really well for Sander. It's a 61 card deck though, and everyone's really using this same exact list, and I honestly am very surprised by that. I do want to give a big shout out to Ermeister, who I think is a big reason that this 61 card list is popular. But why play 61 cards? Like, it literally makes no sense. I interviewed Sander after the game, and he was like, well, why not play 61 cards? It makes no difference. I would contest that point quite significantly. It absolutely does make a difference. It doesn't make a big difference, but it does make a small percentage difference. Let's say even if it's like 1 in 1,000 difference, to play 61 cards and 60, why not just play 60, right? There's literally no benefit of playing 61 cards in my mind. It just doesn't really make sense to me personally. But really cool to see the build. And clearly it's a build which is working very well for people. It's a deck I haven't yet experimented with. Look out for it because I'm going to build it quite differently, I would wager. Up next, we're going to go on to the Lorcana Anniversary Tournament at the Player Network. This is possibly an online tournament. I'm sorry that I don't have the exact knowledge of where it was. Maybe it was in person. I'm not sure. It might have been a webcam event. My apologies for not knowing. I'm currently traveling in Sweden and just trying to squeeze this in my friend's office because I really wanted to cover all of these decks. But this was a very unorthodox list in the top 16. This was also around 64 players. And the final tournament we're going to look at was around 186. This is just a really spicy deck with Food Fight and Sherwood Forest, which allow you to exert your characters to deal 1 damage to either chosen character, or in the case of Sherwood Forest, chosen damage characters. Robin Hoods can move here for free. There's Mickey Mouse Trumpeteer. What? And yeah, very, very spicy. So giving your Mickey Mouse ward in Sherwood Forest is perhaps an idea. Very, very tasty and interesting with the Robin Hoods as well. doing lots of damage pings, and the Beast can, of course, quest for a lot. I do think Beast Relentless is pretty underrated and could be a really interesting top end for Emerald Steel. Speaking of Emerald Steel, there was another Emerald Steel deck which made the top 16. This one by Blake. A little bit more traditional with the Ursula Deceiver of all. Prince John, so the Sudden Chills, the Storm Rage on the strengths that we're used to seeing from kind of set 3 metagame. There's also Diablo in there. There's Pete in there. You're welcome, Beast, Lucifer, Robin Hoods, and also room for Clarabelle. I think a deck like this could maybe make use of Chief Bogo. I think Chief Bogo is being quite underappreciated in the current metagame. I think Emerald Steel's really a deck to keep your eye on. I think it's maybe a lot better than people realize, would be my gut feeling. On to the top 8, we have the aggro Steel Amethyst deck I mentioned earlier with Maleficent, Brooms, and Followers as very aggressive one-cost characters. Also has Pascals. Captain Hook is a one-drop with a little bit more control potential, and Mickey Mouse is actually a pretty tasty one-drop for aggro decks because it has resist 1. It's very difficult to deal with. Only 2 snakes. Always play 4 snakes, even if you're not playing rabbits. It's just good on a Maleficent, for example. It's good on Doc. And Doc is really interesting, I think, in Steel Amethyst because you can play this character to draw 2 cards if you have no cards left in hand. And then you can bounce it back later on, right? Like, let's say you just find a fox or a snake, but not another Doc. Well, you can use those to use the Doc again and draw 2 new cards. Amethyst Chromacon's in there, Smee's in there, Lawrence, Pinocchio, Library, and a single copy of Tiana. I do think that there's a lot of potential in hyper aggro builds outside of just Amber Amethyst. Although I do still think Amber Amethyst is probably the way to go. That would be my gut feeling. Another song deck, this one by Ernie. 3 Daisies, 2 Piglets. Pete's in there as well as the Cinderella Stout-Hearted. Only 2 Naveen's. Big shout out to Ernie. We're going to be looking at another Amber Steel deck in a moment. Christian into the finals, but coming second with Ruby Sapphire. They have 3 of these Sisus as well as 3 Ice Blocks. Only 2 Brawls is something to note. I think a lot of these Ruby Sapphire decks are being able to play less copies of Brawl now that Diablo isn't quite as... well, it's not quite as common in the meta, I suppose would be the correct phrase. Flavisham's in there. Only 2 B-Preps, 3 Sisus. I kind of like the idea of more heavy on the Sisu when you're playing Ice Blocks and the lower cost Sisu. Of course, there's also the option of going down an item route. And speaking of items, what is this deck? Which one? It is absolutely mind-blowing by Micah. It focuses around the new card, Prince John Gold Lover. Beautiful, lovely taxes. You can exert this character, play an item from your hand or discard with cost 5 or less for free exerted. So the main targets for this are going to be items which banish themselves after 1 use. Sword of Truth, the Plank, and Poisoned Apple being 3 good examples of that. Sword of Truth can be banished to banish a chosen villain character. The Plank, you can spend 2 to banish and banish a chosen hero character, already a chosen villain character. And the Poison Apple, you can spend 1 to banish this item and exert a chosen character. But if it was a princess, banish her instead. So you've got coverage on banishing princesses, villains, and heroes, which is pretty insane coverage. And then the Prince John can just pull this item back into play. And a lot of these ones you don't even... doesn't matter if the item's exerted, right? I don't think. Because it doesn't say exert to do this. It just says banish this item, banish chosen villain. It doesn't say spend 2, exert this item, right? Whereas a lantern, you would have to exert. Or a shield of virtue here, you would have to exert. These kinds of cards like Potion of Might, you don't have to exert them to utilize their abilities. So that's really interesting. Worth mentioning LeFou synergy with Prince John as well. When you play this character, ready chosen character, they can't quest for the rest of this turn. So while Prince John can't quest, you can use its ability twice in a single turn. Same with Triton. So that's a really cool way of building your deck. Something to look out for. There's also Sven now in Amber, which I think is a card a lot of people are underestimating. And it's also nice to see King Candy. I do think King Candy is a bit of an underestimated card. While it's uninkable, you're drawing 2 cards, and then you can often put an uninkable card onto the bottom. Up next, finally, last but certainly not least, let's look at Charlie's Collectible Show. Nearly 200 players and a 10K over in America. So I'd have to say out of all of the events, this is the event I would kind of put the most pedigree onto in terms of optimized deck lists, because there was the most players by far, and there was lots of players traveling far and wide from America. Now, that's not to say the other decks aren't worth seriously rating, because there was really, really high play over at Malmo Games Week with lots of great players. It's just that I think that this tournament in particular is one of the biggest ones we've had so far. Maybe the biggest, actually, for set 5. So we're going to start off with a top 16 deck, which caught my eye. And this one's by Eric, who was playing a bit of a traditional, classic, steel Amethyst mid-range deck. Of course, Pete being the new kind of centerpiece card with this deck. When you pair Pete with Amethyst, you're able to replay it multiple times to really disrupt your opponent's game plan. 3 Queen's Castles for Elsa, also in the mix as a new card. Cogsworth is in there, which can allow you to give rush to a bunch of your own characters. I think it's a really interesting build. I actually like the build quite a bit. I would probably be tempted to fit in that 4th copy of Queen's Castle, maybe even try and fit in some libraries with brooms and Chernobyls perhaps, but I really like the look of this build. I think this is a really nicely built deck by Eric. Not sure about Captain Hook. Can help you against Daisy Duck, but does it even help you that much? There's not really a big difference between 2 damage or 3 damage on Daisy Duck, right? You need 4 ultimately, so I'm not really sure about Captain Hook personally. But apart from that, I quite like the look of it. And next we have a Emerald Amethyst deck. I think this is the exact same list we looked at earlier, the 61 card deck. It's actually not. There is actually a few subtle differences here. So I'm not sure if it's 60, 61. Not going to count. But there's Rafiki and the Library in here, which are definitely some different cards compared with the other lists we've been seeing. But looking like a very, very similar build. And clearly this kind of shell of a deck is performing very well for people. But again, I'm going to say again, I still think this list can be optimized further. Up next, we've got Lucas Serrano, who I believe is a player which has won a Golden Mickey and has had some very, very good top cuts. They've certainly had good top cut results at Disney Lorcana Challenges because I do recognize the name. And they played a good old faithful Ruby Amethyst going with the Minnie Mouse and the Olafs in at 1 without any copies of Teeth and Ambitions, which I'm really curious as to why they went for these cards and not, for example, going for Chernobyls, Magic Brooms. Maybe just wanting to have some more beefy characters to challenge Daisy multiple times. Of course, with an Olaf, you could challenge Daisy and then finish it off with a snake. 4 copies of Flynn. I think Flynn is very much back in the Ruby Amethyst decks. 4 Crabs as well as 2 copies of Bee King, Undisputed. 4 Elsa in there. 1 Giant Sisu, 4 Bee Preps, 2 Tremaines, 3 Medusa. Pretty top-heavy list from Luca, who did really, really well this weekend. Also in the top 8, we've got Jarrett Zimmerman on Ruby Sapphire. Not playing the Queen stuff, but does still have 3 Icebox and 4 Sisu Daring Visitors, as well as 4 Sisu Empowered Sibling. I actually really like the idea of this split. Heavy on the Daring Visitor, heavy on the Sibling, and heavy on the Icebox is probably the way I would go about things as well. There's also 3 Cuzcos, which is going to be great in Sapphire Mirrors because you can put the opponent's Lucky Dime into the Inkwell, which means that Tamatoa is not going to be able to grab it back. I like the look of this list actually quite a lot from Jarrett with the Tipo, the 1 jumps, as well as Vision for the future to get some really powerful digging in the deck in the late game. Also in the top 8, we had Sapphire Steel. First Sapphire Steel deck of the video. Not too many set 5 cards in here, but there is a Pete Games referee, and for some reason there's a Kronk, which is like a set 2 card, which has never seen play. During a turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you may deal 2 damage to a chosen character. So it's like a Tinkerbell. It's always a card I've honestly liked the look of, and never tends to make the cut. So I can actually see an argument for playing one of these. It's like a budget Tinkerbell in many ways. It's not quite as good, but it's not a million miles away. 3 Grab Your Swords, 5 Cogsworth, Chempo's in there, Beasts in there, Ariel's in there, Cuzco's in there, Pete's in there. Pretty similar to the kinds of Sapphire Steel decks we've seen in the past, but great to see Sapphire Steel still getting some good results. Into the top 4, it's another Ruby Amethyst deck, and it's another Ruby Amethyst deck with the Minis and the Olafs. Really curious as to why they're going for these and not going for the Brooms and the Chernobyls. Let me know in the comments why you think that is. If there was Teeth and Ambitions, it would make a lot more sense to me, but there's not an obvious reason for me, apart from the fact that maybe, again, they can challenge into Daisy Ducks multiple times while sticking on the board. Not really sure that's enough of a reason, but maybe it is. 4 Crabs, 3 Bee Kings, and 4 Elsas. None of the Giant Sisus, but playing 4 Sisu Flints. I actually like the look of this one a lot. 3 Tremaines, 3 Medusas, 3 Bee Preps. Maybe a little bit heavy on the top Uninkables. No Queen's Castle. Wait, no Queen's Castle? No Queen's Castle. Huh. Very interesting. Queen's Castle's a pretty good card. Up next into the top 3, we have No I'm Not, who won the Ruby Amethyst Mirror, I guess, for the top 3 game, and has Queen's Castle in there. Also has 1 Sisu, 4 Bee Preps, 3 Reducers, but no Tremaines. I do like playing at least 1 Tremaine, They're on the Chernobyls and the Brooms. This is more like it. Also on the Library. I have to say, I like this build a lot more than the other Ruby Amethyst decks I've seen so far. I like the Brooms, the Chernobyls with the Library. I think that these cards are just too good not to play. They're two of the best cards in the game, in my opinion. And the Library just makes them even better. Flynn Sisu, 4 Brawls. And yeah, this looks like a list very similar to how I would play it as well. I would sneak 1 Tremaine in there, I think, as I mentioned. I actually like being heavy on the locations. I wonder if you could even consider a 3-3 split for Queen's Castle and the Library, especially with the Brooms and the Chernobyls. Do you need 4 Brawls still? Maybe Brawl is another card you could consider reducing the count of. I'm not sure. But yeah, this is my favorite Ruby Amethyst list I've seen so far in set 5. So big shout out to Noah. I'm not playing any Elsas. That is worth mentioning. I think Elsa is also a consideration. It is definitely hard to fit everything in that you want, though. I'm not sure on Brawl. I feel like Elsa might just be a better version of Brawl at this point. Kinda, maybe. Next we have Jose. Jose on Ruby Sapphire, finishing second. Had 3 Blue Fassas and 3 Scars. Look at that. That is really, really tasty. Cheater in the deck, which is able to add a card to your hand if you ink twice in a turn. So play Cheater on 2, you sing 1 jump ahead and you ink, and Cheater is going to draw you a card. Or similarly, you play Cheater on 2, you ink, you play Fishbone Quill, ink for Fishbone Quill, Cheater draws you a card. So it's pretty easy to get good value out of it. 4 B preps as well. Really interesting to see the Blue Fassa actually getting a huge result here. So big shout out to Jose showing us how it's done with the Blue Fassa. Of course, Scar, going to be a great card to deal with those hyper aggro decks, being able to clean out multiple threats at once, and also pretty good at dealing with characters and locations in the same turn. But the winner of the tournament is a man whose decks I've criticized a lot in the past. They're a great player. Their name is Brennan DeCandio. So the question is, am I going to criticize their deck again, despite them winning a $10,000 tournament? The answer is no. No, I really like this build. When DeCandio won a big tournament a few sets back, it was like a 66 card songs deck. And I was like, guys, just because this deck won the tournament does not mean it's optimized. It's more kind of showing you that DeCandio is a great player and that you can win with slightly unoptimized decks. This deck, however, looks very, very clean to me. 4 copies of Prince Naveen is very interesting, no doubt about it. But I can just get behind that idea. DeCandio has always been a big fan of the Lantern. It's a really, really strong amber item, which you can exert to pay 1 ink less for the next character you play this turn. I also do love the Lanterns. It's kind of a bit of a forgotten about card. It can struggle a little bit in a meta where there's lots of Bengers, for example. But Benger's not really anywhere to be seen right now. There isn't that much item removal, so I think that the Lantern was a really, really great meta call here from DeCandio. 4 copies of Pete in the mix as well. There's just nothing I don't like about this deck. I like everything about it. 3 copies of Cinderella Stout-Hearted is a lot, but with the Lantern, you can get this in on turn 4, which is pretty interesting. 3 copies of Zeus, 4 Ursulas. Okay, sure, I can get behind it. I don't know how much I like Ursula Vanessa overall compared to some of the other cards in the deck. I've not really been a big fan of Ursula Vanessa, but I think in Steel Songs, if you are going to play her, which most players do, and again, I haven't really played much Steel Songs in the last set or two, then at least DeCandio is going for lots of copies of Zeus. I think that's kind of the big reason to play Ursula. She can sing Storm, Strength, but she can also sing Zeus. So overall, I actually love this list. I think it looks really clean. There's 4 Smees, 4 Rapunzels, there's 4 Cindys, 4 Robin Hoods. There's nothing I don't like about it. I like that there's Bare Necessities in there as well. Maybe I would like to see that 3rd copy of Bare Necessities creep its way into the deck. But I think it's a really, really good build. I really, really do. Which just proves, guys, I don't always just moan about decks. Sometimes I see a deck and I really like it. And if I'm saying I like a deck, yeah, I'm hard to please. I'm hard to please. So big shout out to DeCandio for taking the tournament down. Big shout out for the deck build. And big shout out to all the tournament organizers who are helping us out. Also, big shout out to my friend Samir, who's let me record this video from his flat while I'm in Sweden for the next couple of days after the event at Malmo Games Week. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. Shout out again to Card Market for sponsoring the video. Definitely pick up your singles. You can see Clarabelle is rising up nicely in price. Anna kind of holding strong. But yeah, big shout out to Card Market for sponsoring the video. Big shout out to everyone for watching the video, and see you very soon. The streams will be back in a couple of days. I'm back on the road again at the weekend in Scotland for another Disney Lorcana tournament, but enjoying it very, very much. Cheers.